Welcome to Session 2. In this session, we're going to look at what happens to us and the receiver during intention. And also, if we're transmitters and receivers, how we build a bigger transmitter and a bigger receiver. The assumption has always been that the brain is static after adolescence and more or less stays the same. But new evidence is showing that our brain is actually plastic and fantastic, and that thought helps us to build a larger radio. To look at this, I had to examine masters of intention and their common practices. So I started with monks. Scientists who study monks aren't just interested in their practices like meditation, but they're particularly interested in its effects on the brain and the possibilities this suggests for all the rest of us. By studying these biological effects, they hope to understand what the neurological processes are that occur during feats of highly directed intention. And also, monks offer scientists the opportunity to study whether years of focused attention stretch the brain beyond its usual limits. So the question is whether the brain of a master intender can become the equivalent of an Olympic athlete's body. And the other question is, does training and experience actually change the physiology of the brain over time? For our purposes, this is interesting because it asks the question whether practice enables you to become a bigger and better transmitter of intention. And, of course, it addresses that big debate in neuroscience, whether neural structure is basically hardwired from youth or changeable, highly plastic, depending on the nature of your thoughts. I'm really intrigued by masters of intention. Those are practitioners of some of the ancient disciplines like Buddhism and Qigong and shamanism and native healing who have been able to train to perform these kinds of extraordinary acts through their thoughts. And so I wanted to work out the common denominators they share. Do the steps taken by a Qigong master to send qi, are they similar to those of a Buddhist monk during meditation? And what mental disciplines does a healer use to enter into a state enabling him to repair someone else? And I also wanted to look at whether or not masters of intention have special gifts enabling them to use their minds more powerfully than the rest of us, or is it an acquired skill that ordinary people like you and me can learn as well? And does practice enable us to become a bigger and better transmitter of intention? The funny thing is everybody's studying monks these days. Monks are kind of the guinea pigs of the neuroscience lab. Everybody's looking at monks. Everybody's putting EEG monitors and caps on monks, or measuring how their heart is going and what's going on in other physiological processes of the body, because monks provide scientists with a brain in bold relief. Monks are able to do incredible things with their bodies and also their brains. So looking at their brains and what they're able to do tells us a lot about the power of intention. For instance, the famous cardiologist Herbert Benson of Harvard Medical School made an incredible study of Buddhist monks in monasteries. They were there in loincloths only, in these freezing monasteries that were something like 40 degrees. And periodically, they were wrapped in cold, wet sheets. Now, with this kind of condition, you or I would go into hypothermia within minutes, and our core body temperature would plummet, and within something like an hour, we would lose consciousness. But in the case of the monks, they not only didn't shiver, they began to sweat. They were able to use the power of intention to steam dry those cold, wet sheets, one after another. In a sense, their bodies had turned into furnaces. They are able to use their minds to lower their metabolism by up to 64%. Monks are able to do other kinds of feats of intention. Besides being able to increase their body temperature by something like 20 degrees, they're also able to lower their metabolism by 65%. Now, other scientists wanted to look at what happens to the brain of a monk during focused intention. The usual assumption is that during meditation or this kind of intense focus, the brain slows down. Scientists often talk about a brain slowing down to an alpha state. And when they talk about that, they mean a state where brain waves are moving in frequencies of 18 to 30 hertz or cycles per second. That's a bit slower than what happens in ordinary waking consciousness. The brain operates much faster then, using beta waves, which is about 13 to 40 hertz or cycles per second. At the University of Wisconsin, neuroscientist Richard Davidson decided to carry out a study of monks to see what happens to their brains while they're doing this kind of intense focus. And he found that rather than slowing down, their brains were speeding up to an enormous degree to a gamma state, which is sustained bursts of very, very high activity, rapid cycles of 25 to 70 hertz, or cycles per second. What would happen is the brain would start in beta waves, then go down to alpha, back to beta, and finally up to gamma. In a gamma state, this is the brain when it's working its hardest, at a state of rapt attention, when sifting through working memory, or deep levels of learning, or even in the midst of great flashes of insight. But this kind of sustained gamma state had almost never been seen before, except among the criminally insane. Furthermore, at these very extremely fast frequencies, brainwaves begin to operate in synchrony. And this kind of synchronization is considered crucial for achieving a heightened awareness. So what we're talking about is hitting a peak intensity, powering up, and entering what I call hyperspace. This has not only been seen among monks, but also other kinds of masters of intention, like the famous psychic Ingo Swann, who's one of the greatest remote viewers in the world. Remote viewing is that technique where someone is able to see items at a distance beyond ordinary senses. Swann once allowed the workings of his brain to be monitored and analyzed by Dr. Michael Persinger, who is professor of psychology at Laurentian University in Canada. Swann was wired to an EEG machine and then asked to use his remote viewing skills to identify items in a different room. At the very moment he was able to see the items remotely, his brain also showed bursts of fast activity in the high beta and gamma range. The interesting part about this study was that the high activity registered was over the right occipital region, which is the portion of the brain relating to sight. When examined by an MRI scan, Swann also showed he had an unusually large right hemisphere lobe in the parieto-occipital region, which again is the portion of the brain involved with sensory and visual input. The same thing was found with a gifted psychic called Sean Harabance. When he was checked out with EEG and special imaging equipment during his psychic activities, Harabance also showed an increase in firing in this right parietal lobe. So he and Swann have an innately greater capacity than normal to see beyond the limits of time, distance, and the 5 major senses. In a sense, they've become bigger receivers. They're able to enter a superconscious state, enabling them to receive information impossible to access during normal waking consciousness. He and Harabance and the monks have all entered hyperspace. When I talk about hyperspace, I mean you're able to attend to the present moment with all 5 senses. You're in a state of being hyper-alert. Although Swann and Harabance are naturally gifted, This is a quality that is open to everybody. You don't have to be a master of intention. Experience matters. It's about practicing, which is what Buddhist monks do. They simply practice and they become masters of intention.